we are streaming on YouTube and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. No, I don't want to save that. Hi, Will. Will's the person who introduced me to Sari many years ago. He's a Lutheran minister in Chapel Hill. They met at one of the events at Fuller. Which one was it, Will and Sari, where y'all first met? Steam. There we go. Hey.
Oh, sorry. Hello. Nothing like a little drama. I really didn't intend for that.
I don't know. It was exciting.
Or not. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, and you.
All right.
Joanna, Jonathan, this is Pam. Pam, Joanna, and Jonathan. And
Very nice.
you remember our friend Trip?
I'm right here. Let's see. I'm making sure.
Oh, the chat's already blowing up with all the love. This is really exciting.
Aw.
All these incredible stone-aged minds. I guess there are worse things to be called.
There are. I've been called some of them before, and it was all right. Where
Is the sound okay on my end?
Yeah.
yeah. All right.
Is that an espresso machine behind you, Pam?
Oh, that would be coffee. It's empty though, but I got my sparkling water. I'm assuming we're not live. We're not live right now,
Well,
right?
we're this part's not going to be recorded. I'm just making sure it's on all the platforms.
Okay.
And I haven't done one at 5 when everyone in my neighborhood's actually online. So I'm making sure the kids are not going to start playing video games.
Now, Joanna and Jonathan, what cities are you both in?
I'm in Oxford.
Okay, that's what I presumed, but
I'm in a delightfully named village called Cocking.
okay. How
I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to find it funny, but I do find it funny. But I haven't told any of the residents that I find it funny.
Yeah, as I recall, there are a number of those in England tucked around here and there. Have some
Oh yeah, I
names
looked it
that
up.
haven't aged real well.
It's really, I looked it up recently. The list of village names, and like a whole bunch of them are very, very funny.
That's funny. All right. There we go. I can now see all the comments across things. So yeah, Joe, we can go ahead and get started. Do y'all have any questions before I hit record and such about order and things?
No.
we have it.
Awesome.
Any secret signals we should know about? Like, don't like.
Nah, but if you when we get to the Q&A stuff, if you want to respond to the question, then unmute yourself, and when other at the beginning where you each get a chance to kind of talk and set the stage, you mute yourself if you're not talking, so that you don't show up on the screen. And like they hear Jonathan's voice, but then they see Joanna's face and they're like, what's going on? And then it switches back. But I feel like I used to have to explain that a lot to professors before lockdown. Now people are much more familiar with Zoom. It became a dirty word as opposed to a mystery. So all right, there we go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are having ourselves a party on Zoom to celebrate high quality, exciting new book, Thriving with Stone Age Minds. And you know what? We got the authors here. We got some of their nerdy friends, and then I'm gonna hopefully guide the ship towards them interacting in ways where they demonstrate their brilliance and respond to each other, the questions many of you have sent in. If you're participating live, you can drop questions there, and you can also talk to each other as it goes along. But one of the exciting things about this book is that this is a really, really well-written attempt at expanding the religion science conversation. The book is not just going, how are you religious and how are you scientific at the same time? But it's showing the creative and powerful invitation that happens when you bring the wisdom of two different kind of scholarly forms of inquiry, of wrestling with a religious tradition, and then the form of life that comes in a religious community, and then those type of questions and narratives, and then what happens with the scientific study in particular here, evolutionary psychology, cognitive science, the psychological sciences. How can these different streams mutually inform and enhance each other, and giving us the tools to see the beauty in each thing, but also invite us into a more full life with our neighbors, our enemies, and all of God's creation. So, I've already recommended it to in my email newsletter, and told quite a few friends that this is a much better book for demonstrating how fruitful the science and religion conversation can be than reading the ones that some of us nerds prefer that go through models and typologies and that kind of thing, because it demonstrates that attending to both can be an invitation to a more full life, and it'll help you be a better parent, like things like that. Like, you don't want to suck at being a parent and a friend. This book will help. Anyway, that's why I'm real excited about it. So the format today is the co-authors, Pam and Justin, will kick things off, share about the book, the process, the big ideas and things. And then two of their nerdy friends, Jonathan, Joanna, will give their initial responses. They'll talk to each other for a minute, and then we'll go into Q&A conversation and such. So I'm going to turn over to Justin and Pam now. But first, before you talk about the book, maybe Justin could give a brief description of his new project at Blueprint, so that for those that are hearing about it for the first time and have seen him on the podcast and stuff before, when he was part of the Theopsych project and everything at Fuller, what's the new thing you're doing, and how's this kind of a part of the future trajectory of your work?
Hey,
There you go.
there we go. Thanks, Trip, for having us on the show, and for hosting this panel. Thank you to Joanna and Jonathan as well for being here. When we were recommending people to talk to us about the book, we certainly wanted people who had asked good questions, but also those who have good answers, to help us with our blind spots too. So hopefully we'll learn from each other as we go. Yeah, Trip, Blueprint 1543 is the new organization that I'm leading. It's a little bitty nonprofit. Our aim is to catalyze the engagement of the mutual engagement of the sciences and Christian theology to answer big questions. We've got a few different kinds of emphases. We are trying to encourage more folks who are Christ followers to go into the sciences in a full-bodied, exciting kind of way, not in a weird kind of marginal way, and not checking their Christian faith at home, but bringing themselves as integrated individuals into the space of science and technology, because it's an important cultural shaping sort of domain, and Christians are woefully underrepresented in that space. And so we'd like to help fix that problem. And then with an eye toward, well, a lot of the biggest problems, questions facing humanity, they require multiple modes of inquiry, as you alluded to, including the sciences, but also bringing some of the really the seasoned perspectives of Christian theology and Christian philosophy and so forth. And we need mature, sophisticated kinds of conversations there to make progress on these big problems. So we'd like to encourage that. How do we do that? Through coaching, consultation, convening, and other kinds of services, or catalyzing, all kinds of things that start with C, different kinds of projects and initiatives, and working with other organizations and leaders. Part of that is through our leadership development Development Initiative as well. You can learn more about us at www.blueprint1543.org. Our Director of Communications, Sarah Concepcion, has put that into the chat for those who are on the live. How's that? Is that what you wanted, Trip? All right.
Oh yeah. That was great. So so now if you want, you and Pam can take it away and tell us a bit about the book, because not everyone read it in the very few weeks it's been out.
What?
I know, but your interlocutors have, and they also happen to have PhDs, which means that the average listener will probably want to know a bit about the book they're looking towards reading. And there's an audiobook, everyone, that if you listen to podcasts, you prefer audiobooks because you sit in traffic, you do the dishes, you can have someone with a very soothing voice read this book to you at double speed. So there you go.
I do like that feature. Just speed the thing up. Yeah, the book. This project started, it's about 8 years ago now. Back when I was the director of the Thrive Center for Human Development at Fuller, a position that Pam now has. And for years, I'd been working in this sort of scientific study of religion space, cognitive science of religion, which brings in evolutionary insights at various points. Honestly, I was a little bit reluctant to bring them in. Many times, it's taken me a long time to get at all comfortable with evolutionary psychology. And part of that personal process of mine of sort of warming up to some of the insights that evolutionary perspectives could give us in the psychological sciences made me realize that, it'd be awfully helpful if there were some book out there that introduced, especially those of us who consider ourselves fairly orthodox Christians, maybe working in the evangelical kind of tradition, an introduction to this evolutionary psychology stuff, but not in a defensive or apologetic or any kind of way, but just in kind of what is this thing? And do we really need to be scared about it? What are its promises? What are its deliverances? And I talked to a couple of colleagues about this and said, hey, we need a book like this. And they said, you're right. And I said, so are you going to write it? And they said, no. And this went on for a few years. And so I was about to give up hope. But then a BioLogos Foundation ran a funding competition for little grants on, what was it called? Evolution and Christian Faith was the name of the competition. And I saw this as an opportunity to finally maybe produce such a thing. But I thought, I don't want to just give like a textbook introduction to evolutionary psychology, but what if we show its potential deliverances in an interesting space on a question that Christians can care about? What is human thriving? And so Pam and I are colleagues in the Thrive Center at the time. And so I approached Pam and said, hey, Pam, you want maybe our team here to work on this or something? What do you think? And as our resident thriving expert, she agreed to take the lead on the grant that then produced this book. So we wrote the grant, we got the grant, we did a series of really workshop sort of meetings with other psychological scientists on our team at Fuller, Sarah Schnittker, Jim Furrow, William Whitney, Tyler Greenway. And then we brought in some outside people, theologians, biblical scholars, evolutionary scholars of a different sort, other psychologists, and really kicked the ideas around for a while before putting the book together, which then it was slow to get to press, we'll say. It's one of those that's had lots of iteration, and even at the end of it, it feels a little bit like, we're just getting started and there's so much more to be said here. But Pam, what was your perspective on, why in the world did you agree to this?
It sounded like fun when you are a nerdy person. No, not. My personal work has really focused on trying to understand what it means to thrive. How do we enable people to become who God created them to be and to be their best selves in most fulfilling lives? And as a person who initially studied theology, and I'm an ordained Presbyterian pastor, ended up doing a PhD in psychology and finding psychology a really helpful tool to be able to gain more insight in what it might mean to thrive. As our book eventually comes to at the end that social sciences, whether it's evolutionary psychology or developmental psychology, ends up not being able to answer a lot of the direct questions about direction and ultimacy that things like thriving might ask, but they do provide a really helpful lens or serve as a helpful tool to unpack this human project, what it means to be a human species. And I had not spent a lot of time in the topic or discipline of evolutionary psychology, but really resonated with the idea of evolution and adaptation and change, and thought as a person of faith, if our species should be going forward from an evolutionary perspective, how might we consider that from God's perspective? What might we gain from understanding the human species process of change and where the human project might be going from an ultimate perspective? So I thought it would be a very engaging conversation and helpful to be able to reflect historically on the human species of what are the unique features or gifts or capacities that enable humans to be human and distinct from other species, and how might those features be related to thriving, and how might that be sufficient, or in our case, we decided not completely sufficient for understanding what thriving is. But my questions have always been practical. How can this pursuit of knowledge, how can the dialogue that we set up between theology and evolutionary psychology serve to enable people to live fuller lives, and to use the word that we often use, to thrive? So that's where I came at it from.
When you think of the book itself and the question of thriving, you kind of talk about three different ways one could even decipher thriving, and I think for both in the sciences, you raise the question that, like, a telos doesn't immediately compute to the way science asks questions and think, but also humans, when you talk about thriving, have a multiplicity of different ways. Like, is it being happy in the moment, like your experience? Is it about outcomes or finding harmony? Or is it about having a life lived well, like on principles that are like lived out in your material existence? When you look at those kind of ways the humans culturally have discussed thriving, and then go to look at the sciences, like, what were the tensions that kind of, made for some real fruitful creative work in the project?
I'll jump in, Pam, but if you want to add to it, yeah, that's right, Trip. So it's common in the Western tradition to think about thriving or a life lived well or something like that, to have those three dimensions. It feels good in some respects, it goes well with the environment or is productive, and then it's sort of lived right, you might say. I mean, those are some really quick, short ways to summarize those three perspectives. But notice that all of those have some sort of baked in assumptions that can be informed by looking at human psychology in one way or another. So, well, what are the things that make us feel good? Or, if you're emphasizing that more hedonistic side of thriving, well, why those things among all of the things that could make us happy? They're not the same things that other species sort of seem to find enjoyment from. So why do we gravitate towards the things we do? Where do those come from? Can we get a better purchase on those? And then, a life sort of lived in harmony with the environment, including a social environment, physical environment, so forth. It sort of nicely kind of brings to mind how the evolutionary perspective on how humans fit into their niche, and how we navigate the relationship between environmental demands and the kind of equipment or biological endowment we have. And then that third category is sort of, and what are good things, that good principles to live by? Well, those are, at least in part, going to be conditioned again by where we find ourselves. What's our situation? What are the tools that we've got? We can't ought to do certain kinds of things that we're unable to do. And so then looking at the kind of equipment that humans have, our psychological equipment, where that might have come from, what it might be good at and not so good at, could help us understand a little bit better. It doesn't completely answer the questions, but it helps us understand, I think, a little more fully, well, what are those goods for us? But as Pam's already alluded to, we're pretty open in this book that we don't think just taking an evolutionary perspective sort of by itself gets you there. It's only this evolutionary psychology kind of approach conditioned by or framed by a certain kind of theological framework that seems to give any real payoff. Otherwise, we're still quite adrift. And we're still trying to figure that out. But yeah, Pam?
Sure. So Chip, one other thing I'd like to highlight that I think was compelling to me about evolutionary psychology is the reality of change. And when we started this project 8 years ago, none of us would have anticipated the speed of change, the chronic acceleration of change that we have experienced culturally and obviously of late with COVID and all, that we have needed to adapt radically, constantly. And so in my understanding of thriving, both theologically and also more from my developmental science frameworks, I knew at the heart of thriving, something had to do with change and the ability to adapt. And evolutionary psychology is really helpful in terms of recognizing this constant tension between the niche that the species lives in and how the species might change the niche and create a new problem. So change and adaptation is obviously at the heart of evolutionary psychology. So for me, that was a very deliberate draw to think about, how might this lens of evolutionary psychology give insight into how the human species can do this adaptation, maybe not at the genetic level, but how can we do this change thing well? Or how can we do it better? Because as we know, soon as every time we try and solve a problem in our niche or environment, we are creating a new problem that we then set out to change. So that was something that drew me particularly. And I have to say, like Justin, a point he made that I super appreciate, since the time of the book, questions of what is the good life have raised their head in both secular and philosophical, religious life. But I have decided good is the next four-letter word. What does the good life mean? And so that was also something I was trying to find answers to in this project, which is one of the things that we actually didn't find an answer for necessarily in evolutionary psychology, but it pointed us towards other resources for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, what we're going to do now is let Joanna give her initial response to the book, the project, the big ideas and stuff, and then Jonathan can jump in and share his, and then we'll begin kind of unpacking and responding to it. But Joanna could go first, then Jonathan. But Jonathan, when she's done, you can just unmute yourself and talk. We don't have to, skip between things. So the floor is yours, Joanna.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for letting me see the book before it came out and have a chance to comment on it then. And thanks for letting me be with you today. I would say that any work that brings contemporary scientific psychology and Christian faith together in some sort of dialogue is going to interest me. And whether we understand that meeting to be about engaging with ontological realities, or whether we understand psychology as a kind of hermeneutic lens through which to read the Bible or to understand Christian dogma. Either of those ways of looking at it, I think, are interesting and fruitful and exciting. And having made that kind of general comment, I just then go on and say I found the book really interesting because it has an original approach to this dialogue and it has an original kind of thesis at its core. And I thought that it offered a kind of intriguing alternative to Augustine's account of what the image of God is in the human person when he talks about the human trinity of intellect, memory, and in some versions, the third one is will, and in other versions, it's love. But that resonated very strongly with me with your trinity of relate, learn, and regulate. So the human person as a social being as someone who, a being who can process information and learn and adapt on the basis of that information, and crucially through regulation and self-control. And in another life as a clinical psychologist, I worked a lot with people who had frontal lobe damage to the brain, and I saw the clinical impact of what happens when you don't have that ability to self-regulate and control, and how very destructive that is in terms of relationships and what we might understand thriving to look like. And one thing, and Pam's already mentioned this, that I thought it would be good to reflect on, maybe not today, but just at some point, is how these particular qualities that you've identified have shown themselves in and through the pandemic. I think they've really been thrown into relief there, how people have acted cooperatively or not, how they've learned incredibly quickly, how they've had to self-regulate and self-control. And another thing I really appreciated was that emphasis on telos, the idea that the life of faith is dynamic and goal-directed, and that very much gels with my own understanding and work on this. And I thought the best sentence in the book, actually, which I just come back to again and again, is near the end, which is where you say it's critical to distinguish one's human purpose or telos from one's personal current purpose or vocation. To distinguish between one's human purpose or telos, between that and your personal current purpose or vocation. And I'll maybe refer to that in a question shortly. So I also agree that our calling, as you say in the book, is to live into that purpose and to become who we are meant to be. And that we know when this is happening because we have experiences like flow, which relates to the way you unpack concepts of thriving and flourishing. But I've thought about this a lot, and in my own kind of work, I kind of wonder if there's a circularity risk in the argument, that, you know, we have a definition of whatever makes us feel at peace with self and the world and God must be a reflection of our telos. And the definition of our telos is whatever makes us at peace with self, the world and God. And perhaps a way of getting out of that circle or breaking into that circle is this idea of conformity to Christ, or living into the image of God, which you also talk about. And I just come back to the idea that Christ is not comfortable, and that he says, I come to bring not peace, but a sword. And we have to kind of work out what that is trying to say to us. In the context of all the helpful stuff we've learned from positive psychology about what it means to thrive and to be at peace, and to understand what shalom means for us and creation. And the other aspect of the thesis that really appealed to me, and that seemed to have significant theological traction, is this idea of the gap created between the niche which we construct and the needs of the next generation. What solves problems for us can be problematic for later people. And I thought that was particularly fascinating, because I think something I've come to understand more and more is that running right the way through the New Testament is a kind of intergenerational conflict at work. And it has particular focus, but it just so happens that the gospel that's set for this week in my tradition, and which I have to prepare as a sermon, is from Mark chapter 7, which is the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, because he doesn't keep the tradition of the elders, and in which he says, well, you know, I'm paraphrasing now, that niche worked for you, but actually it wasn't always about that. And he sets his idea of a yoke that is light against the burdensome yoke that has been inherited by his people. And I thought there was lots of traction in your idea of kind of the limitations of a niche, in engaging with the idea of the law as something that was good and yet hems people in, and the need for liberation from it. So my questions are really around your human trinity, and whether there's a place for creativity in there alongside the qualities that you've talked about. I wondered whether your distinction between telos and current personal purpose is a bit like the distinction between the fruit of the Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit. And I wondered whether you thought it would be helpful to look at the way Paul engages with the law in Romans and Galatians in terms of a niche that is no longer a good niche. And in relation to that, I wondered whether some of the stuff we get from evolutionary psychology informs our understanding of what Paul means by the flesh, rather than ideas of sin. And if it connects a bit more with the flesh, then perhaps one of the things we can take from your book is the capacity to be a bit kinder to ourselves in terms of our human inheritance and what we often see as our limitations. So those were my thoughts, and thank you for writing it.
Have you not written your sermon for this Sunday, Joanna? So I'm going to try to not repeat everything that Joanna has said, although our sentiments, I think, are very similar. So I like Joanna, I'm a psychologist and a priest in the Church of England. I try to wear both hats at the same time. And I have a sort of reputation for being skeptical that science has anything particularly interesting to say for theology. In part, I think that's because I mostly focus on metaphysical issues, and I tend to think that metaphysical questions are poorly answered by recourse to empirical facts, which I take to be the main purview of the natural sciences. But actually, the other reason for my skepticism that science has very much to say for theology is mentioned in the book quite prominently, which is the sort of assumption which I don't necessarily share, but which lots of people do share, that there is a fact value distinction to be drawn, right? That descriptive facts don't give us normative conclusions, or does not entail ought. So it turns out actually that the thing that excited me the most about the book is that even though it pays in the most positive kind of way possible lip service to this is-ought distinction, fact value distinction, descriptive normative distinction, like I think it contains resources for us to go beyond that particular détente. So Anglicanism is interesting because it is itself a capacious tradition that spans evangelicalism at one end and Catholicism on the other. And one of the interesting things about the Catholic tradition, both in Anglicanism and elsewhere, is that it has never really let go of this idea that that morality can in some way be read off human nature itself, right? So it's quite trendy these days, I think, even among evangelicals, to talk about virtue ethics, to talk about virtues, to talk about flourishing and thriving and teloi. And all those things Catholics never really gave up, right? Like Protestants gave it up a long time ago. And part of the reason for that is this sort of like fact value is-ought distinction, this sort of like normative descriptive distinction. And having given up the virtue tradition, which has as one of its core assumptions that we can in fact read, if only obscurely and partially, we can in fact read normative conclusions from descriptive claims. Protestants, and then also after them, atheists, kind of were led down, roughly speaking, two trajectories, right? So one is to just be like a divine command theorist, right? Or some other kind of deontologist to say, look, here are some rules delivered from on high, in the scriptures or by the magisterium or something like this, and these give us our morality. It doesn't really matter what human nature is like. These are the rules that God has given to us. So that's one trajectory that certain people went down for a long time. And a lot of Protestants, I think, kind of go down this line. And then you have the sort of thing that I think attracts secularists a bit more, which is to take a very particular slice of description and normativize that. The most common of this is pleasure, right? So utilitarianism tends to focus on pleasure and suffering as its main facts upon which to build a moral philosophy, or if you like, a moral theology. And then, of course, some secularists just abandon the project of objective morality altogether and say, look, there are just no objective moral facts, and therefore there's nothing to read out of our human nature, and there certainly aren't any delivered commandments from on high. So for a long time, I think outside of Catholicism, like that was the state of affairs until maybe the 80s or 90s, and then Anglicans like myself and Joanna, and then other Protestants began to kind of, pay a bit more attention to the world of virtue ethics, and kind of maybe less friendly to but like natural law theology, which is of one piece really with virtue ethics, whether or not we like to associate the two. So the thing that excited me about this book is that it seems to, despite saying that there is an is-ought distinction, like it seems to want to do quite a lot with description in the normative direction, to go, let's look at what humans are like, where we came from, how we evolved, and also how particular things make us feel and behave, and what effects particular kinds of behaviors have for ourselves as individuals, but also as communities and across generations. And let's take that as an important source for reflecting normatively. And that seems to me to be the sort of thing that I think, without the benefits of experimental psychology and evolutionary psychology, that looks to me like the sort of thing that Catholics have been trying to do literally for centuries. So you see this, for example, in Thomas Aquinas, where when Thomas Aquinas tries to figure out what the good is, he turns to some theory of human nature. Now, he doesn't have evolutionary psychology for sure, but if he had, I get the feeling that that's exactly what he would turn to. And modern day Catholics, maybe the most famous ones are, at least to this audience, are the ones on the US Supreme Court and the people who taught them, including at Oxford, where Joanna is, have a bunch of assumptions about human nature that deliver for them, so they say and they think, deliver that for them what constitutes the good, or rather the goods, the sorts of things that are human goods, so such that if we pursue them, that's what the good life is, and by extension is what the moral life is. Now, for the most part, they're also not doing that job with the benefit of evolutionary psychology, which is, as I say, again, the thing that excites me about this book, which is it helps to inform, or could help to inform, a conversation that is centuries and centuries old, which for the most part, Protestants have not been interested in participating in. And now, like you are, which is great, I think. So it's not the science religion conversation that excites me the most, I think. It's kind of the sort of ecumenical Protestant Catholic conversation that I can kind of see over the next few years as people like Justin and Pam, and perhaps myself and Joanna get interested in talking across our denominational boundaries with this descriptive base in common, right? We might have our different theological presuppositions, we might have our confessional differences, but if we begin with scientific theories and the discoveries that are made that we can be fairly sure about, and if we can agree that these are important facts to consider when we're thinking about ethics, when we're thinking about the good life, the moral life, that goes a long way, I think, in bridging our ecumenical divides. So that's the thing that excites me the most. I think my instinct is to want to push Justin and Pam a little bit further than they're willing to go, to say, okay, why not just abandon the is-ought distinction, or rather not abandon it altogether, but but to really own the idea that actually these facts, right, that we're discovering as psychologists about human nature, about human thriving, both individually and intergenerationally, like these are actually really, really, really important and central for theological reflection on morality and on the good life. And there are, I guess, a few ways to do this. One, I think, probably Justin and Pam will like more, which is to begin with a set of propositions already from the scriptures, from our theological traditions, and then try to read through that lens the evolutionary psychological literature. The other kind of more, I think, more old-fashioned way of doing this is to try to do the work independently, to do the theology independently from the psychology, and then bring them together to see what the consonances are. But I don't know, like maybe the evolutionary psychology should help us read the scriptures, right? Should help us read the theological tradition to go, look, you know, when the scriptures, when the theological tradition talks about human flourishing, like we can flesh out what that means by reference to evolutionary psychological theories and empirical discoveries. So in that sense, you know, we might be able to give the sciences a more prominent, more important role than one of mere correlation or one that is, you know, to be kind of like shaped by our theological presuppositions, or if you like, our theological prejudices. So that was my first kind of like response to the book, was one of excitement in the kind of ecumenical direction. The other thing which I think I've more nascent thoughts about, or rather maybe I have more questions about than answers to this point, Justin, for a moment, is this question of whether or not human nature has within itself resources to live the good life. So this is a debate that goes back for centuries and centuries, right? About the extent to which supernatural interventions is required for human beings to be good, right? Or asked another way, you know, exactly what it is that Christ does on the cross and in the resurrection that transforms us. What does this transformation look like? What does it comprise in, right? And so the set of questions I have about this are, wait, well, if our natures, as we can read them from evolutionary psychology, points at a set of capacities which tell us something about our teloi, is the claim that these capacities are capacities to fulfill our teloi, or is it that these capacities are capacities that kind of indicate to us what the teloi are, but we're very clear that on this side of glory we're unable to fulfill them, or rather maybe, you know, without divine intervention helping us along the way, we're unable to fulfill our teloi. So like I like sort of interested in how Pam and Justin think about the relationship between our evolved dispositions and abilities on one hand, so evolved plus scaffolded by society and culture, like whether or not that to Pam and Justin are kind of enough. Are they themselves the gifts that God has given us to live the good life, or is some supernatural intervention required, as lots of Christians, Catholic and Protestant, have believed for a long time in various sort of theories of grace and nature? So two questions, I guess. One about grace and nature, and the other about the relationship between the normative and the descriptive, and how we think we can move forward with you know, kind of thinking about the evolutionary psychology in order to construct a moral theology.
Well, thank you both for those responses. Pam and Justin are going to give their initial response, and then we can, I will play voice of the people. So while they're responding, I'm going to try to order questions around things that haven't come up, and then ones that further what you've all talked on. But yeah, that was a blast. So, and also for those that are viewing, if they assumed some common knowledge because they're super nerds and you want to know what it is, feel free to ask it. They all professionally teach people these things. So, when when PhDs all talk to each other, the shorthand is not because you can't comprehend it. It's a shorthand to save us time when talking. But one of the greatest things you do as an educator is getting to explain the shorthand so other people then get those resources to think with it. So if there's something that you're like, obviously they all think this is completely clear, then you mention that too, and we can clarify that. So, and Justin will explain it all in 2 sentences or less. He'll define everything. Then Pam can grade them, and we'll give thumbs up or thumbs down. Anyway, Justin and Pam, if y'all want to give any of your initial responses and thoughts, you can go for it.
All right, sure. I'll take a stab, Pam, and then you can save me when I'm struggling. And thank you both for those very thoughtful comments. It's very clear to me that there's a whole lot of work to be done here, and I'm just grateful that you both found the kind of framework we were introducing as productive in these directions. I think this is one of the reasons why when I finished the book, I felt very unfinished with the book, right? I mean, Pam and I went, well, at some point you got to just stop. But there's so much more to dive into. And you've managed to put your fingers on some of the things that I think have been bothering us a little bit, or at least tickling our brains in some ways. To try to start the conversation, I guess I want to go for what I detect to be a couple of points of mutual interest. Because I think, Jonathan, I think your concerns about the is-ought distinction are actually not so far away from the observation I think Joanna was ending with the distinction between maybe flesh versus sin in Pauline writings. One of the things that one can't help but notice once you're sort of paying attention to it when you read Christian theology is when we're talking about either, salvation, various issues around the atonement or sanctification or many of these other kinds of topics of soteriology, the notion of human nature comes up over and over and over again. And but really there are lots of different natures that get biblical attention, and one of those is sin nature, as well as just sort of our created nature being imago Dei. And then there is this interesting concept of sarx, flesh. I think it's one of the, like 3 Greek words I think I know, not having the theological education the rest of you have, but and there I take it we're trying to get at some kind of distinction between, well, what might be the kind of created nature of humans such that God would say these critters are very good and I want to have this special kind of relationship, and in some way they're going to image me in this creation and be my representatives, or however you want to unpack that. That's one sense of human nature theologically. And then there's this distorted, diseased, imprisoned, held captive kind of nature. That's this notion of sin nature. And I'm not even sure where sarx falls in this, or this flesh. Where does that fall? Is it an imperfected kind of created human nature? Or is it the damaged one? And so there's a difference between imperfected and damaged, right? Because we can be imperfect and very good. We're limited by the nature of the kind of animal we are, living in, developing in, expressing in the kind of world that we're in. And that's not necessarily bad in a moral kind of sense, right? So there's certain things I can't do that I hope in the new heavens and new earth I will be able to do. Maybe I won't be as follicularly challenged, perhaps. That one doesn't bother me too much, but I'd like to get my vertical leap back a little bit, for instance. They're simple little things, as well as more profound things. that we all have, that are limitations by virtue of just being this kind of animal that we are. It's not a moral failing, it's just the nature of us. So I think at least those three different concepts, we can figure out where they overlap. That sort of just created nature that maybe is imperfect, not fully actualized. There's the sort of idealized kind of nature, what humans could be in their fully expressed form. And then there's the damaged or fallen nature of humans. So I take it there are at least those three natures floating around in theological discussions. And then we could turn back to and does evolutionary psychology help? Or the psychological sciences all help us to identify which are which. And I want to be cautious here, but I think maybe yes, a little bit. But I have to build in some assumptions. So if I take as an operating assumption that say evolution is the way that God chose to make the animals that we are, it would be surprising, I think, theologically surprising, if somehow God despised that nature, that he despised that process that he chose to bring us about, that he thought there was something morally shortcoming about that nature that he's done. And so evolution then, at least taking an evolutionary perspective, I think can help us see when is something really kind of a sensible part of being the kind of animal we are versus a problem that needs to be fixed. So let me try to get specific with that. One that I hear people ask about a lot is human groupishness. Okay, we've got this strong tendency to, as psychologists have demonstrated well before evolutionary psychology, right? We have that strong bias, these sort of in-group biases. We treat people who we identify as our kind of people in a very different way than we treat other kind of people, people that we've identified as not in our group. We show predilections to learn from people we perceive to be like ourselves, to imitate them, and so forth and so on. Okay, there are lots of research on this. And so then we might ask, well, is that sinful? Is that sin nature in some way? Or is that just kind of what it means to be a human? Well, it's hard to see. It's hard to know. It's tempting to just look at what are the consequences of those sort of in-group biases and conclude, oh, well, it leads to all kinds of negative things. But one of the nice things about an evolutionary perspective, I think, is it helps us zoom out from the particular local situation where things are going wrong and say, yeah, but taking sort of a broader time scale, looking at the kinds of problems that this might have helped solve over eons, it turns out, well, maybe actually it's a good thing to have a certain degree of in-group biases. This is really adaptive. It helps you figure out who do I need to learn from? Who do I need to reciprocate with? Who can I trust more naturally? Who can I help more naturally? And so forth. And as a group species, very group living kind of animal species, we need the ability to be able to take care of other people in our group. And yeah, we do have more expertise for taking care of those people. And we have more on the line as individuals and members of families and other kinds of things, right? Okay, so it's not obvious from an evolutionary perspective that a certain degree of groupishness is a bad thing, it turns out. What turns out to be a bad thing is then when that natural tendency towards groupishness finds itself in new situations that it's ill-equipped for, and now we need to fix it. So I'm tempted to say that the evolutionary perspective actually can help start to disambiguate these different senses of nature and then get a little closer, I think, then to this is-ought kind of question. I still insist it doesn't give us, we can't get rid of that distinction. And partly because of what Joanna suggested with Jesus is a problem case in this regard. Jesus, or if you want to very quickly move to, well, if it's an adaptation, if it's fitness enhancing, then it's a good thing. I'm like, well, Jesus did a lot of things that sure don't look like they're fitness enhancing, right? At least for his genetic line, we don't have good reason to think that he was terribly good at fitness. sacrificing yourself for the world, not a good thing. Without having kids, without, whatever, right? Encouraging your own half brothers to die too prematurely, etc. Not fitness enhancing. But what I think this approach can do is help us see, again, extracted out of the particulars of local situations, get a broader picture of what are the consequences of the kinds of capacities and tendencies that we have, so that we can evaluate them on that basis as well as in the particular. And then maybe locate the problems in a different place. It's not having to do with maybe our tendency to be groupish or our other kinds of what you might think of as just created limitations that we have because of the kind of animal that we have, but it's because of how they fit in certain kind of circumstances, or how that's been distorted because of how we've modified our environments, that leads to the problems that we see. That's sort of a first stab at trying to pull some of those things together. I have a couple of other thoughts on sort of the second suggestion that you made, Jonathan, but I want to pause there and let Pam jump in if she wants, or either of you to respond to what I've said so far. Or Pam, you could pass. You go, no thanks. I don't want to touch that.
I want to give Joanna and Jonathan an opportunity to respond specifically to what you just said. If you'd like to do that now, I've lots of comments too.
Justin, thank you for that really helpful answer, which I think drew a lot of commonalities out of what might have sounded like quite diverse comments from me and John. And I think I kind of agree with you in what you say. I think that there is a kind of at least a third description of human nature other than idealized and tainted by sin that the evolutionary psychology really helps us with. And the reason I think it kind of resonates with some of what Paul does when he talks about the law is his own kind of ambivalence to it. It's a good thing, and yet it's doing us bad. It's a God-given thing, and yet it's gone wrong. And running through a lot of his thinking is, it's not evolutionary psychology. It's a bit like what Jonathan said about Thomas Aquinas, but there's this wrestling with the sorts of things you've just been talking about, which is human nature and how what is good, and often what has been good generationally, can quickly turn to the bad. And I think what it offers us is a way that's different from beating ourselves around the head, and could lead to despair and depression and, well, we can't do anything about it kind of attitude. Also, what you said about God loving his critters reminded me of the Lenten collect, which is, "O God, who hateth nothing that thou hast made," it begins, which is a brilliant statement. Why would you make something you hate? But just reminding God that that's the case in that kind of cheeky way these prayers do. So just wanted to thank you for your response, which I found really helpful.
Yes, I thought that was great too, bringing our two sets of comments together, and I agree that they do sort of resonate with each other quite well. So definitely agree that what one doesn't want to do is to obliterate the is-all distinction in such a way that all our evolutionary predispositions are baptized as good. That would be I think unhelpful. But like, again, trying to sort of push you a little bit further. I wonder though whether or not you think that that what we know about how humans evolved and the predispositions and capacities that we have as a result of our evolution, whether or not you think that helps us to adjudicate between some debates among moral theologians, right? So, I mean, like, I hate to jump into this particular debate so quickly, but look, the fact of the matter is that whether we like it or not, churches are like enmeshed in arguments about sex and gender, right? So conservative Catholics and Protestants both want to say, and actually St. Paul kind of does this too, right? So on one reading of Romans 1, what St. Paul is doing is constructing an argument from nature, right? So the argument goes, look, it's just not natural for for people of the same sex to be in romantic relationships with one another, right? So St. Paul kind of does this, right, in Romans 1, and modern conservative Roman Catholics and Protestants will do this too, right? So then this question is, okay, so what resources do the psychological sciences have and can bring to bear on this question, not directly on the normative stuff, but first on just the sheer descriptive claim of naturalness, right? So like with that as a kind of more specific question, with a gaze toward a more general one about the relationship between naturalness and evolutionary psychology, like, do you think that there are stronger resources from the evolutionary psychology side there that can be brought to bear on these debates that we have among theologians?
I'll respond to that in context of my broader responses. I think something that you both alluded to and that we maybe do or have a gaze towards or flirt with is really wrestling with a new hermeneutic that really proactively and intentionally addresses the different epistemologies of theology, philosophy, and sciences. And I think we have to acknowledge, whether we're theologians or more identify as scientists, that with our rapidly increasing knowledge, that this hermeneutic that would be integrative, that might consider two different epistemologies from Mother Nature or quote unquote divine or supernatural sources, needs to be chronically updated. And I know, and all of us sit on the fence between theology and particularly psychology, and there are different set approaches for doing that. But I think at this day and age, we actually really need an updated one, and one that probably takes a lens more of practical theology than just like systematic theology, but that is worked out in our experience of the world. So Jonathan, when you bring up the continuing pressure to revisit issues of gender and sexuality that are raised by our current moment, whether it's our lived experience or our knowledge of science. And from my perspective, I alluded to earlier, to me, one of the greatest gifts of evolutionary psychology is the emphasis on change. And so as Justin noted, like, it's really helpful to provide a framework that might shed insight into our local culture or to a local context. But for me, that locality is not just like place, but it's time. So how I think traditionally the church has so valued tradition and set liturgies. And I think we're really in an era where we have to be more proactive and say, vehemently regard what is working of our theology, what needs to be enhanced, renewed, revisioned with the knowledge and understanding we have of our current day. And I'm not saying be relativistic or throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think the gift of telos or teleology is it keeps one eye on the future or on the ideal, the eschatological of what God is calling us towards. And it allows us also to revisit the present and how we are exegeting scripture, tradition, implementing liturgy, etc. And I think having that dual perspective provides new insights into new forms, new practices of liturgy, new forms of congregations, new understandings of scripture and theology, and a much more invigorating understanding of God and theology for people today. And I think that speaks to your issue of goods. In our short email exchange, I offered that I tend to not think of a list of goods as either capacities or set static things to pursue, but my work as a developmentalist has really pushed me to reconceptualize telos, not ever as a static endpoint, but telos is a dynamic process. It's an ongoing relating to God, others, even I imagine on the other side of eternity, that will chronically inform what our goods are. So I tend to think of goods are, what are our processes for discernment? How do we in 2021 continue to discern what God's invitation for us is in this world? Where I am drawn to virtue, and I love the emerging virtue science, because I think virtue are adaptive muscles. They're adaptive capacities that enable us to live out purpose. We can understand that sometimes we need to be patient. Sometimes we need to be impatient in pursuing purpose. But for me, the framework of that practical theology pushes me towards is this ongoing engagement and relating to God. And so, even from our model of the learning, relating, and regulating, in our very nature of relating to God, to others, we learn. And the burgeoning body of socioaffective neuroscience even says people learn better when they're connected to, when they have a secure base. When people feel known and loved, their minds are more plastic and open. And that also enables them to regulate. So I would say that the features God maybe perhaps endowed in us, and that continue to evolve in us, they are helpful. I still don't know that they're sufficient because of sin, but they sure do enable us to relate to God and to love God directly, whatever that means, which probably won't figure out in this life or through others. But those are some things I would offer. And the last thing I want to put out that you made me ponder is, how do these features of the human species inform like a Thomistic understanding of desire? Like our desires that we're constantly and chronically trying to align to God's desires probably are related to these features. And I tend to think of them more related to telos, that I conceive of becoming like Christ as our unique selves, as related and giving to others. But how those desires or those deepest human needs, based on our understanding of human nature set forth in this book, I think might shed light on desires.
That's really helpful. And there was a couple questions that came in around this, I think might bring in those that may not have followed all the dots. And one was the connection Joanna made earlier between the law and Pauline reflection and what you talk about in the book as niche construction. And that in some way, the law and a niche emerge for a fruitful purpose when they emerge. And then they both generate desires, right? The law, with the prohibition comes the desire to break it, like Paul talks about. And with a niche, it leads to a kind of flourishing and their legacy in a different context it ends up problematizing them. And throughout the book, you talk about the gap between nature and niche, and that one of the gifts of a theology that is shaped by evolutionary psychology is that we can start to see the way the social cultural structures have connected to our biological and cognitive inheritance, and learn to negotiate them with goals that are not determined by the desires that come from just our biology or instilled in us from our cultural inheritance. And I wonder if maybe you could attempt to connect the dots with how that nature niche gap plays a role throughout the book, because it's been assumed in so many of your responses thinking about theological anthropology, but a number of people that are unfamiliar with evolutionary psych may not know what's all entailed in that gap that I think y'all constructively engaged.
Pam, did you want to go first, or did you want me to?
I'll go first since you. Sure. No, I think this is, forgive me, a fun feature of the book. I think this is really helpful. This has been really helpful for me as a psychologist in thinking about this concept of, as a human species, we have a proclivity towards innovation, towards wanting to better things, towards solving problems. And as we do that, we continue to create gaps. So just when we're comfortable in our environment, we end up fiddling with it. And lo and behold, we create a problem. Plastic bags, all of a sudden are a great replacement for brown paper bags, but they create a problem for recycling in the environment. I loved Justin's example in the book of kids on a pier or a dock and jumping for one of those huge inflatable pillows. If you ever went to a Young Life camp or some camp, it was a great feature of camp. But it's this idea of like jumping for a next level, but then it always moves a bit and creates a gap. So I think that is a chronic aspect of the human journey and process. And so if we simply think of thriving as closing that gap, that's helpful from like an Evo Psych perspective. I think that works, but it's not terribly meaningful. And there's numerous ways to close a gap. So how do we discern, understand what is the most meaningful way to do that? And that's where I think telos and purpose come in very handy, because they end up giving us guidance on what direction and how to do that.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah. So there's an assumption that not everybody listening will be all that familiar with, because it's become common. It's common in the Western world anyway, to assume that a basic way of understanding humans is that we are complete blank slates. And what really sort of makes us special is that we can learn anything and everything, given the right conditions and motivations. It's sort of a learning model that we see in our school systems, we see it in society and so forth. And frankly, I think it's more a product of the Industrial Revolution than it is of educational psychology, or maybe Industrial Revolution informed educational psychology. To a degree it shouldn't have. You can run people or kids through some kind of timber mill that we call an educational system, and however you tinker that mill is what you get on the other side. So kids are tabula rasa, and there's a philosophical tradition behind that as well. And so are adults on this view, but that view just doesn't square with either the evidence that's coming out of early developmental psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and it doesn't fit with what we're learning from comparative or evolutionary psychology. Here, comparative means cross-species comparison. Instead, we get a different picture. Yes, humans are really special to the degree that they're flexible, that they can learn new things, and all of that's true. But it doesn't follow from that we don't have characteristic ways of doing things and learning things and selectively processing some kinds of information, maybe more eagerly than others, attending to this instead of that, drawing these kinds of conclusions instead of those from the information, where either one are sort of live options. We've got biases and predilections baked into the way that our minds naturally develop in ordinary human environments, just by virtue of being human beings in those ordinary human environments. Okay, so that's a different picture of what a mind is than a lot of us are sort of familiar with from just the way that society seems to operate, and also from a lot of the social sciences that have emphasized our amazing flexibility in learning, our adaptiveness to new environments, and so forth. So if you emphasize that too far, then you lose that, yeah, but there's still something distinctive about what it means to be a human. We shouldn't just replace human nature with human nurture and then go on our way. Then yes, humans are naturally nurtured, and by nature we're cultural animals too, and we're culturally conditioned. All of that's true, but that doesn't mean we're culturally determined, and that doesn't mean that anything will do, that we could learn any possible thing. We still are animals with certain kinds of predilections. Once we accept that as the way that the sciences are pointing, then we realize, and then that nature, let's call that thing our nature, has better or worse fits depending on the kind of features of the environment. The features of that nature, if they have arisen because they were adaptive for our ancestors in certain environmental conditions, then the closer the current niche is to those environmental conditions of the past, the more likely it is we're going to have a good fit. That's the way the logic goes. But Pam's right. We're constantly fiddling with our niche. We're constantly changing what that fit looks like, because a part of our nature is to solve those problems in creative and interesting kinds of ways. And I think that's where the creativity does come in, is the environment. Joanna asked about the creativity side of it. We use this very special mind that we've got, the ability to collaborate on certain kinds of projects to address the needs that are presented by a new niche creatively. We culturally scaffold that through the creation of artifacts, institutions, social arrangements in order to help us solve those new problems in that new place. Migration, clothing, tool making, mastery of fire. There are lots of different things that our ancestors have done, and we just take them to a whole new level now, right? Now it's computer technology is helping us have this kind of an interaction across great distances. That's all part of this niche construction process. But no matter how optimistic we are about our ability to solve these problems, what I think we can't lose track of is, yeah, but we haven't changed our nature in some deep fundamental kinds of ways. And so it can create stress and tension that then manifests itself in terms of anxiety, perhaps, or different kinds of diseases and maladies. And we've sort of sprinkled throughout the books lots of little examples of these kinds of things to try to make the point. But you could go on for days and days giving these kinds of examples. So for those who were not, I hope that's helpful sort of just background to frame some of these comments. And so then, as Pam was saying, I think then addressing that gap between our nature and our niche isn't enough to sort of guarantee this kind of thriving. As Joanna sort of highlighted, we also want to say something about, yeah, and can we do that responsibly? Can we do it in a way that we don't make the problem harder for everybody else that's coming sort of next, for our kids, for the next generation? And part of this is, look, it's just sort of, being a parent, you become aware of these kinds of things in a different kind of way. The enthusiasm that this last, the past 20 years have seen for, say, STEM subject learning, so science, technology, engineering and mathematics kind of learning. We have all of these sort of documents and initiatives that every kid needs to sort of master these things, and every kid should go into the sciences. And sure enough, they've all been convinced that they ought to. So at least in the United States, recent surveys suggest about half of kids going into college say, yeah, I'm going into a STEM subject area and so forth. And the truth of the matter is, the stuff is hard. STEM subjects are really not very natural. They're the product of hard intellectual work under very particular cultural conditions that have been heavily culturally scaffolded in a very particular part of the world, in a particular part of history. And they have to continue to be sort of carefully crafted. And that's just to say, it takes a lot of niche construction to get somebody to master these kinds of skills, which is why most people don't find it all that easy. And so then it's a little bit of a pipe dream to say, everybody just needs to do that and be awesome at it. And then in the future, 100 years from now, everybody is going to be a science and tech geek. Well, that's what sci-fi films want us to think. But the truth of the matter is, this is just too hard. Unless we start tinkering with people's sort of biology in fundamental ways, that's not going to happen, because there's too big a gap between our nature and that kind of niche demand. So that's just one example then, that when we start imposing that on, say, our kids, well, what's the result? Lots of kids are anxious. Lots of kids feel like, well, this isn't me. They try, they go their first year of university and they wash out. And now they're demoralized and suffer from depression and all kinds of other psychological ailments, because why? We've sold them a false bill of goods, right? We've told them, oh no, anybody can do this. You just have to try hard enough, or you just have to have the right educational environment. Well, as the parent, one of my kids can do that stuff. The other one that's not her jam. She's a creative type, and it would torture her in a really deep way if we forced her to sort of become a math and science nerd. That's just would be cruel. It would not promote her flourishing or thriving. So I'm just developing one little example to give people a taste of some of the stuff that we're talking about in the book. Oh, thanks. And I'm seeing that people are putting some really helpful stuff. Thanks, Pam, for putting things in the chat for us as well. Yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah. So I think the thing you say about the gap for learning the natural sciences actually also applies to to theology, right? So some of the work that you have done, that I do as well, tells us that some parts of our expected religious beliefs from our traditions are, let's call them natural for now, but then other elements are a bit of a reach, right? So it's perfectly easy, if you like, and natural to believe in a supernatural agent. Much less easy to believe in classical theism, right? That the god of the philosophers, as it's sometimes disparagingly called, but actually I think the god of the Christian tradition and the Muslim and the Jewish one is a sort of difficult concept to grasp. And why should it be easy, right? Because we evolved cognitively to grasp medium-sized objects, right? Which is to say that it makes quarks difficult, but it also is to say that it makes angels and God difficult, neither of whom are medium-sized objects, for different reasons for why quarks are not medium-sized objects, right? In that angels and God are, in a sense, not objects at all. So there, I think that leads us to this question about whether or not that which is endowed to us by nature, evolved or otherwise, is sufficient for the good life. If the good life requires or involves interaction with the divine, not the divine as we imagine him, right? As John Calvin says, the mind is a factory of idols, but communion with the divine as God truly is. And if it's the case that our minds didn't evolve to grasp things like gods, which are not things at all, then it seems that we have new texture to the claim that faith is a gift, right? Not endowed to us completely by nature, but somehow requiring divine intervention. Does that resonate at all with how you think about the relationship between evolutionary CSR and religious epistemology?
At the end there, Jonathan used the CSR, that means cognitive science of religion, for those who don't know. Yeah, we could talk about this for a long time. I guess my current position on this is that we often set the bar intellectually type really probably should be careful of and repent of. I'm half joking, but I'm half serious there.
I think God muted him because we didn't hear what you said, and it sounded like it might have been blasphemous. That was probably very adaptive.
Oh, Benny, and he froze again.
He was good. I think God is definitely telling us something.
Well,
okay, it's oh, sorry, unstable network.
You're stuck in your niche over there.
Yeah, somebody's fiddling with my niche, that's for sure. Sorry about that. No, I mean, I think of it this way. One of my, I've got a good friend who is almost 6 years old. And he's been my friend my whole life, or his whole life, not my whole life, his whole life. He's been my friend. And certainly by the time he was 2.5 or something like that, I think most people would say that he loves me and that we have a good relationship. But it would be quite a stretch to imagine that he had a very thorough knowledge of who I am, things that I've done, my past, my intellect, any of this stuff. And it doesn't, and as far as I can tell, it really didn't matter. It still doesn't matter. We still have a good, loving relationship. And that's just to say, I expect that no matter what we can figure out theologically, God doesn't hold us to a terribly high standard from his perspective in terms of getting all of the bits right, in terms of who he is and understanding him. And so then the question, though, is, well, what's enough to have that kind of relationship? And does he tolerate our really imperfect kind of visions of him? I suspect so. I think, at least as I understand, most folks who, for instance, read, the Old Testament scholars would think that the ancient Hebrews probably had a pretty crude kind of knowledge of God, and that would include people who God clearly, at least if we take the testimony of Scripture seriously, clearly had a very special kind of appropriate relationship with, like Adam. He was probably some kind of a polytheist who was also probably had some kind of highly anthropomorphized and other kinds of limited view of God, and that was okay. And at least I can't tell that we are supposed to think that he was an idolater because of those things, but that he had an appropriate relationship. So do we get that naturally? We might get a lot closer to that than it might first appear, by virtue of the kinds of the way that our minds work, the natural propensities we have towards seeing design and purpose, seeing the good, seeing that things have some kind of ultimate cause that sort of lean us toward belief in some kind of supreme deity. We don't even need to use that term, something that's starting to approach God. I think it gets us a lot of the way there. Does it need to be completed, enhanced, refined through special revelation? I think so. And in some ways, I think, at least if we're going to help Joanna write her sermon on Mark chapter 7, we can come back to that, because it's interesting you've raised that, because I've used that as an example before in talking about cognitive science of religion, where it looks to me, sort of from my perspective, Jesus, in some ways, what he's saying is not unlike what you were suggesting. He's saying to the religious folk of the day, look, you've slipped into some really weird kind of very intuitive but not right models of doing religion. So we see cleansing rituals all over the world. Why? A sort of evolutionary psych perspective on this is that the evolved system we have for managing hazards in our environment, unseen hazards, pathogens, for instance, trip a system that will go into highly ritualized kinds of cleansings and other kinds of behaviors. And the input conditions of that system can be mimicked by cultural forms, such that probably, at least among the most common kinds of rituals we see across traditions are cleansing rituals, and they're very important, and you must do them just so. And if you don't, not only, you are unclean in a really important and fundamental way. Well, that's kind of a natural outgrowth of a system that was meant to keep you sort of safe from pathogens, perhaps. And it's kind of been abused in a way. But there's a natural intuitive core there, which is why the Pharisees could really hang on to these things good and tight, and they could persuade so many people of the importance of these things. And one way to read Jesus in this situation is saying, hey, look, guys, you went too hard on the wrong point of this. You missed the thing. There's something very natural that led you down this path, but we need to right that ship. You've moved off a dunk or sprinkle. Goodness, people are putting things in the chat.
Can I just pick up on that the way he does it is along a kind of teleological gradient, in that he goes back to Moses, but he's actually saying, I'm doing a new thing. With regard to the eschaton, and he does that with keeping the Sabbath as well. So there is something there about looking back, like you do in evolutionary science, to earlier conditions and what was good, but not being stuck there, and neither being stuck in the present either, but saying, let's use this to actually lay out something that is new. And on top of that, he talks about it's not working because you're neglecting your grandparents, because you're using money you would have used for them to pay the temple tax. So he's taking a kind of empirical measure of flourishing and thriving and chucking that in the mix as well. And I think it speaks really powerfully to your model.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a nice point.
So we're almost out of time, but I wanted to let everyone say one last thing. So I thought I'd give a very generic answer that or question that each of you can take however you want. There are a bunch of questions from ministers and ones from parents that once evolutionary psych, faith, and flourishing were connected, they had anxieties and worries and challenges. Be it I'm going to run through the list of topics people sent in. From well, there were some funny ones that I thought would trigger Justin about their love for personality tests like the Enneagram. But then what do we do with social media? The way we become more tribal in lockdown? Will Facebook be seen as addictive and horrible as sugar in 100 years? How do we parent in a nuclear family? They don't seem natural. Are they horrible? Will Evo Psych help us figure out how to respond to challenges that we don't recognize that are on other scales like ecology? What does it mean that humans know we're going to die? How does that make our psychology different? There's a stack of ministry related ones, a number of them related to what's the big deal with that 150 people thing, which is in the book, by the way, person that asked the question. But what do we do with that? If you wanted your kids to love themselves, would you live in an urban or rural environment? I mean, then there are more theological ones, but I think it'd be fun because three of you are ministers, and we have parents on here as well, to pick one of the questions that as a person of faith and as someone engaged professionally in the psychological sciences, that they both came to help you answer a question that a lot of people ask. So you can pick any topic, but a short nugget of wisdom, and hopefully these will all be lures to invite people to check out the book, because it's quite a bit of fun and covers a whole bunch of topics we didn't get to.
I'm going to jump in about the death one, because in a previous life, I used to write a lot about death. My PhD was on death anxiety and religious belief. Okay, so the question was, what does it mean that we are aware of our mortality? So I'm going to give a theological answer rather than a psychological one, I think. So two things. One is a kind of pushback against what I think sometimes we feel that our religious traditions want us to minimize or deny our mortality by emphasizing the kind of heaven bit, right? So across lots of religious traditions, and certainly within Christianity, there is this temptation, if you like, to go, well, like death is no big deal, right? Because we're all going to be fine in heaven, at the end of glory or whatever. So I think that's a mistake. I think that our awareness of our mortality is an opportunity for us to be bothered by it, to realize what a big deal mortality is. That as natural as it might be, it is also an utterly devastating loss. Right? It's like we feel terrible when we lose other people to death. When we die, we lose everybody and everything. So it seems odd to, feel the death of other people as a loss, but not our own mortalities as a loss. So I do think that our ability to know that we will one day die, should be an opportunity to be bothered, to be, I don't know if terrified is the right word, but to be dissatisfied for sure, to be angry, maybe to be upset in any case. And so in the old days, the sort of C.S. Lewis's and G.K. Chestertons of the world kind of built on that and went, well, what does that desire tell you, right? What does this anger at our mortality, this dissatisfaction at our finitude tell us about where we belong and where our home is? So that's one thing I want to leave people with, to think about our awareness of our deaths as a way of thinking about where we belong and what we are and ought to be. And then the second thing has to do with the vocations that to which Christians are all called in our baptisms. Justin mentioned earlier that cleansing rituals are plethora across cultures. And it's very tempting to think of baptism as a cleansing ritual. And of course it is. Of course, there's a sense in which baptism is a cleansing ritual. One of the descriptions of baptism, both in the New Testament and in the Christian tradition more broadly, is that of our sins being washed away. But I hazard that another and perhaps more important description of baptism in the New Testament and in St. Paul in particular is that of drowning, right? That we die with Christ in the waters of baptism to be raised again in new life when we are taken out of the water. And I think let's focus on that rather than the cleansing bit for now. That we are very seriously called to die, right? To be drowned. And again, in the New Testament, there is language of dying to sin, dying to the world, being dead in Christ, and therefore no longer slaves to the fetters that we see around us, which are part and parcel of daily living, right? To be dead to the world, to be dead to those desires, is to be freed from the enslavement of normal human life, of discourse of rights and what's rightly mine and rightly yours, of the trappings of certain kinds of poisonous groupishness, right? To be tied to our ethnicity or nationality or gender or to our family. So to die to all of those things allows us to break free from what you might think of as, the constraints to love that are imposed upon us by biology and culture both. So the ability to know that we will one day die, to reflect on what death means, I think should help us also realize what it means to be Christian, what it means to live Christianly. If one of the central rituals of Christian initiation is about death, about dying to the world. And so that's what I want people to think about when we think about death, is on one hand, where do we belong? What is our home? What is our nature, given our anger and our upsetness at death? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is like thinking about what death entails. What does that mean for how we should live our lives as dead men and women walking, as having been drowned in the waters of baptism?
Well, I feel like that was a little beginning of a revival sermon, Jonathan. All right. Did any of the other topics pop up? You don't need to give a whole sermon because we have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. All right, Joanna.
When the first Christians were baptized, there's some evidence that as they came out of the water, they began the Lord's Prayer with the word Abba. And part of the bridging that gap, and this comes back to the questions on children, is that we've talked a lot about cognitive capacities in terms of evolutionary theory, but there are affective and relational capacities, the capacity to trust that Justin was talking about, and the intimacy of parent-child love. And it's that's the kind of cornerstone of what Jesus is offering as the mark of new life, this kind of trusting intimacy that Paul calls faith. And that resonates really strongly with our natural capacities that have evolved. So there's something about taking what is natural to us and transforming it. And just to note that Jesus did not live in an ideal family setting. It was highly dysfunctional, dangerous, not too far off what we're looking at in Afghanistan at the moment. And yet within that, he models a transformative capacity for intimacy. So wherever you're bringing your kids up, there is hope, and it's rested on, I think, unconditional love and intimacy. That's the core of the gospel message.
On that note, I'll somewhat follow up. A lot of specific questions about parenting. Where should I raise my kids? How much Facebook? How much technology, etc. And hitching off of both what Jonathan and Joanna said, I think the Christian tradition, Christian theology, has done much more with the concept of death and dying and crucifixion. And so much of my experience of the Christian tradition in more evangelical circles has been living a life in response to what Jesus saved us from. And I think as Jonathan invited us to contemplate the significance of death in order to understand the significance of life in liberation in God, I don't think our Christian theology has gone so far or done so well on helping us understand what Jesus saved us for. So we're really clear on death, sin, but what for? And in my professional journey, I have found psychology and theology amazing dialogue partners to understand more about being saved for liberation, glorifying God as ourselves, pursuing purpose, pursuing vocation, and joy. Heidelberg Catechism, that our greatest ends are to enjoy God and glorify God forever. And I think this evolutionary psychological perspective provides really great insight on how we do that through learning. But Western culture way overemphasizes learning, as Joanna just says, but through intimacy and love and relationships. And also through regulating, through being able to set goals, to regulate our emotions, to change our goals. And I think as parents, when you're looking at things like technology, whether it's Fortnite or Facebook, urban, suburban, rural places to live, it's about finding that good fit and enabling your kids to continue these ongoing projects of learning and relating and regulating. And if they have problems with executive functioning, scaffold them in that, because regulating is really important to thriving. If they have problems with learning, figure out what ways they do learn well, whether it's maybe they're not a STEM person, but they're a dancer or a singer. Maybe they learn other ways, and help them figure out how to relate. And forgive me, but our niche was really effed with in the last couple of years. And we've had to get really creative about how we relate and learn. So no matter what happens, quarantine, urban, suburban, figure out how to help your kids relate, figure out how to help them learn and grow, help them figure out how to regulate in meaningful ways. And I think something that seems so esoteric, evolutionary psychology and Stone Age brains and human thriving, I think has some really practical implications for how we thrive, how we glorify God and enjoy God forever.
All right, Justin, you have any final thoughts?
What they said, that was pretty good. I like it.
You endorse
like
it. All right, good.
But Enneagram, no Enneagram.
I thought it would get you. I thank you all for hanging out, for all of you joining us, all of you joining the stream, and those that listen later on the podcast. This has been a bunch of fun, but you can on the page that has the edited version on the podcast, you'll find links to the book, the Thrive Center stuff, blueprint, and links to Joanna and Jonathan's work and things. So if you want to find more, go there and click to your heart's content. And may you all find ways to thrive. And when you don't, remember your brain's from the Stone Age. So it's an opportunity to give yourself grace. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Trip. Thanks all. Sure enjoyed it.